Congratulations, son. For a second, I thought my father had misspoken. It was 7:47 in the morning, and I was standing inside the executive conference room wearing the navy suit I had bought specifically for the promotion announcement he had promised me. But Caleb, my 28-year-old brother, was sitting in my usual chair beside Dad. My boss was there, HR was there, and when I looked down at my phone, the company-wide email had already been sent. Please join us in congratulating Caleb Bennett, Vice President of Operations. I looked at my father. What exactly is my role now? He smiled like he was doing me a favor. You'll stay Director of Operations. Caleb will handle executive leadership. Then he pushed a thick folder toward me. You'll train him. I opened it. Forecasting, vendor negotiations, compliance, client escalations, staffing. Every major responsibility had my name beside it. Caleb got the title, I got the job. I closed the folder, stood up, and said 6 words. Then he can learn without me. The room went completely silent. Dad gave a short laugh. Pearl, sit down. I didn't. Because what he didn't know was that I had 11 minutes to make a decision he never thought I was capable of making. I walked out before anyone could stop me. Behind me, Dad called, Pearl. I kept going. 14 months. That was how long I had spent rebuilding Bennett Industrial Systems Operations Division. 14 months of 6:30 mornings, emergency client calls, vendor disputes, missed weekends, and fixing problems that somehow always became mine. 6 weeks earlier, Dad had stood inside my office and said, finish the turnaround and the VP position is yours. I believed him. That was the humiliating part, not that he chose Caleb, that I had actually believed performance would finally matter more than favoritism. Back in the conference room, the transition packet had told me everything. Caleb would receive the salary increase, executive authority, corner office, and decision-making power. I would teach him how to do the work. Dad had even said, this is what family does. What family apparently did was take the daughter who had saved 2 major accounts, cut operating losses, rebuilt a failing department, and make her an unpaid safety net for her younger brother. And Caleb's expression told me he wasn't blindsided. He had given me that careful, apologetic smile people use when they already knew the bad news was coming. That bothered me almost as much as Dad's decision. I reached my office, shut the door, and locked it. Then I opened my laptop. There was an email waiting near the top of my inbox. I had received it 3 days earlier. Final executive offer, Meridian Logistics Group. I had planned to decline it. Why wouldn't I? My father had finally promised me the position I had worked years to earn. Or so I thought. I opened the message. The offer expired that morning. At exactly 8 a.m., I looked at the clock in the corner of my screen. 7:49. 11 minutes. 11 minutes to decide whether I was going to spend another decade proving myself to a man who had just handed my promotion to my brother, or walk into a career where nobody knew me as Richard Bennett's dependable daughter. I didn't click the Meridian offer. Not yet. The handle on my office door rattled once, then again. Pearl, Dad. I unlocked it. He walked in without waiting for an invitation and shut the door behind him. The smile he had worn in the conference room was gone. You embarrassed me in front of Martin and HR. I stared at him. That's what you came in here to say? You stood up in the middle of an executive meeting and walked out. You gave my promotion to Caleb. Dad exhaled through his nose like I was being difficult. I gave Caleb an opportunity. You promised me that opportunity. He looked away for half a second. That was enough. You knew, I said. Pearl, you already knew when you told me 6 weeks ago that the VP position was mine. He walked toward the window. Caleb needs a chance to grow into leadership. I already grew into it. Dad turned around. And then he said something I don't think he realized would change everything. You're better at the actual work. I just stared at him. He continued, almost impatiently. That's why this arrangement makes sense. Caleb can handle the executive side, and you can keep operations running smoothly. I gave a short laugh. Not because anything was funny. So, being better at the job is why I shouldn't get the job. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. His jaw tightened. Caleb needs confidence, and I need what? Another workload? You've always been stronger than him. There it was. The sentence I had heard in different forms my entire life. Caleb forgot something, I covered for him. Caleb struggled in school, I helped him. Caleb made a mistake at work, Dad asked me to fix it quietly. Every time I handled more, Caleb was protected from having to handle anything. I folded my arms. Does he even know the Northgate renewal is in 17 days? Dad paused. Only briefly, but I saw it. That's not the point. It's our largest client renewal this quarter. You'll handle it. I blinked. There it is. What? You gave him the promotion and you still expect me to do the work. Dad's voice hardened. Nothing actually changes for you. I looked at him for a long moment. That is exactly the problem. He stepped closer to my desk. Pearl, I am not going to argue about this all morning. Caleb has a transition meeting at 9. You will be there. And if I'm not, his face barely changed. You will be. There was something colder about the certainty in his voice than if he had shouted. He pointed toward the office around me. You've spent 9 years building your reputation here. You know these clients. You know these teams. You know what walking away would mean. I did. He thought it meant I had nowhere else to go. That was the part he had wrong. Dad opened the door, be in that meeting at 9. Then he left. I waited until his footsteps disappeared. The clock on my screen read 7:55. I reopened the Meridian email. Then I opened a private folder. Performance reviews, project approvals, client letters, restructuring documents, records with my name attached to the work I had actually done. I wasn't taking company files. I wasn't forwarding confidential material. I was simply confirming that I still had lawful copies of my own evaluations and documentation. Proof of years spent doing exactly what my father had just decided someone else should be rewarded for. At 7:59, I opened Meridian's secure acceptance portal. The offer was still active. Senior executive role, higher compensation, real authority, no family name attached to the decision. My cursor hovered over the button. For years, I had told myself staying at Bennett Industrial Systems was loyalty. Maybe some of it was fear. Fear that leaving would mean Dad had been right about me somehow. Fear that everything I had built only mattered inside his company. The clock changed. 8 a.m. I clicked. Accept offer. At 8:58, I walked into Caleb's transition meeting. Dad saw me first. The tension disappeared from his shoulders almost immediately. He thought I had surrendered. Good, he said. Now we can move forward. I took an empty chair near the end of the table. Around me sat 6 department managers I had worked with for years. People who had watched me rebuild schedules, negotiate vendor contracts, and handle client emergencies, while Caleb spent most of his time in business development. Caleb stood beside the screen. Behind him was a presentation. The next era of operations. Thanks, everyone, he began. Obviously, I'm excited about what we've accomplished and where I'll be taking the division next. The first few slides were harmless. Then, slide 4 appeared. Operational restructuring results. I recognized every number because I had produced them. Caleb talked about reduced vendor costs and improved delivery performance as though he had overseen the changes. Nobody interrupted him, but several managers stopped looking at the screen and started looking at me. Then Caleb reached the onboarding slide. Pearl will oversee my 90-day transition, he announced. She'll help bring me up to speed on the technical side. Dad leaned back with a satisfied smile. Pearl knows this department better than anyone. Caleb couldn't ask for a better teacher. There it was again. My competence being used as justification for putting someone else above me. Caleb clicked to the next slide. A diagram appeared. I sat forward. I knew every box, every sequence, every performance metric, my vendor optimization framework, except one thing was missing. My initials. Caleb pointed toward it. This is the framework we'll be expanding under my leadership. I looked directly at him. Which framework? He hesitated. The vendor optimization model. The one on the screen? Yes, I nodded. Can you explain why the supplier risk threshold is weighted at 18%? Silence. Caleb looked at the screen, then at Dad. Well, the exact weighting is more of an operational detail. It determines which contracts automatically trigger secondary review. One manager lowered his eyes toward the table. Another shifted in his seat. Caleb cleared his throat. I'm still getting familiar with some of the finer points. Dad cut in. Pearl, we can discuss technical details privately. I agree. I turned toward the screen, but the attribution should be corrected before this presentation is distributed. The door opened behind us. Denise from HR walked in carrying a folder. She caught the last sentence. What attribution? Dad answered quickly. Nothing important. I kept my voice even. That optimization framework was submitted 11 months ago under my name. Denise looked at the screen, then at me. You developed this? Yes. The original project approval is dated September 17th. One of the managers spoke quietly. I remember that review. Dad stood. That's enough. We're getting distracted from the purpose of this meeting. Nobody argued. They didn't need to. The room had changed. 5 minutes earlier, Caleb had been presenting himself as the man inheriting a successful division. Now, everyone was wondering how much of the success he was claiming actually belonged to him. Dad ended the meeting early. I gathered my notebook and walked into the hallway. Pearl. Caleb came after me. His face was red. What was that? I stopped. What was what? You deliberately made me look incompetent. I asked you one question about a framework you were presenting as part of your leadership plan. You knew I wouldn't know that. That's an interesting defense. He lowered his voice. I've been in this job for less than 2 hours. Exactly. His expression hardened. Dad said you'd help me until I got comfortable. That stopped me. Not because of what he said, because of how casually he said it. I studied his face. How long have you known? His mouth opened, nothing came out. How long, Caleb? His eyes shifted past me. I turned. Dad was walking toward us with Denise behind him. Pearl, my office, now. Caleb stepped away, and suddenly I understood why he hadn't looked shocked in the conference room that morning, why his apology had looked rehearsed. He had known, maybe for days, maybe longer. Dad entered his office and held the door open. Denise followed us inside. I took a seat. Dad closed the door. Then he looked at Denise and said the words that turned our family betrayal into an official employment dispute. Document her refusal to perform assigned duties. Denise didn't start writing. She looked at Dad first. What assigned duties specifically? Dad pointed at me. The transition responsibilities she refused this morning. She's undermining the new VP in front of his department. I leaned back. I haven't refused to perform my job. Dad gave a humorless laugh. You walked out after I told you to train Caleb. Because training a newly appointed vice president to perform executive responsibilities isn't in my director of operations job description. Denise turned toward me. So, Pearl, to be precise, you're willing to continue performing your existing responsibilities? Every one of them. And the transition? I'll provide a professional handover of my existing records and responsibilities. I will not become Caleb's unofficial vice president while he holds the title. Dad slapped his palm against the desk. You don't get to rewrite your responsibilities because you're angry. I'm not rewriting anything. I reached into the folder I had brought with me. I'll fulfill my existing role during my notice period. Dad stopped. My what? I placed a signed letter on his desk. my notice period. For the first time that morning, my father had absolutely nothing to say. Denise picked up the letter. Dad stared at me. You're resigning? Yes. Over a promotion? No. Over what the promotion showed me. His eyes narrowed. And where exactly do you think you're going? I've accepted another position. That was all I gave him. No company name, no title, no salary. He didn't get those details yet. Dad pushed the resignation letter back toward me. You're not going to walk out in the middle of a major transition and expect me to give you a glowing reference. Denise immediately straightened. Richard, he looked at her. Employment references must follow company policy. Dad's face tightened. I opened my folder. That's actually why I'd like several documents added to my HR record. I placed the first page in front of Denise. Dad recognized it instantly. His message from 6 weeks earlier. Finish the turnaround and we'll announce you as VP. Then my latest performance evaluation. It credited me with leading the operational turnaround. Then the original vendor optimization framework Caleb had presented that morning. My name, my submission date, my approval record. Finally, I handed her the 90-day transition plan Dad had given me. Denise compared the documents. Her expression changed. Richard, was HR informed that Pearl had previously been told she was receiving this position? Dad leaned back. It wasn't a contract. I know, I said. He looked at me sharply. I'm not claiming it was. I want my employment record to accurately reflect what happened. That unsettled him more than an argument would have. I wasn't begging him to reverse the decision. I was documenting it. By lunchtime, the first consequences had already started. My phone rang. Caleb, Pearl, I need you downstairs. For what? Jason says he can't approve the Vantage supplier change. He can't. Why? Under the hierarchy Dad approved this morning, it requires VP authorization. There was a pause. So, approve it. I'm not the VP. Another pause. Longer this time. Pearl, seriously. The contract documentation is in the vendor management system. I don't know what I'm looking for. Then, I suggest you read it before authorizing the change. I hung up. I wasn't sabotaging him. I was doing something far more dangerous to the arrangement Dad had created. I was letting the vice president be the vice president. That afternoon, Martin Shaw appeared at my office door. Can we talk? He closed the door behind him. I didn't know Richard had promised you the position, but you knew Caleb was getting it. Martin looked uncomfortable. I knew Richard had been discussing a succession structure for several weeks. I frowned. Succession structure? He rubbed his jaw. Pearl, there were conversations about where Caleb would eventually. A knock interrupted him. The door opened. Denise stepped inside carrying several printed pages. Her face was different now, serious. She placed them on my desk. These are notes from the executive planning meeting where the promotion decision changed. I looked down. One section had been highlighted. My father's name appeared beside it. Denise tapped the sentence with her finger. You need to read what your father told us about you. I read the highlighted sentence twice. Then a third time. Pearl will complain for a week, then she'll fix everything. She always does. I looked up at Denise. He said that? She nodded. According to the meeting notes, Martin stood beside my desk, silent. I kept reading. Dad had never argued that Caleb was more qualified than me. In fact, the notes said the opposite. Richard Bennett had described me as the strongest operational leader in the company. Then came the part that finally explained everything. Dad was thinking about succession. He wanted Caleb positioned as the future face of Bennett Industrial Systems because, in his words, clients and investors would eventually expect his son to lead the family company. Caleb needed the executive title. I needed to keep the operation functioning underneath him. That was the plan, not an impulsive act of favoritism, a structure. Caleb would lead. I would make his leadership work. My framework appearing in his presentation suddenly made sense. So did Dad telling me nothing would really change. So did Caleb saying Dad promised I would help until he became comfortable. My father hadn't underestimated my ability. He had built his entire plan around it, and he had assumed my loyalty had no limit. I want copies of anything I'm entitled to retain from my personnel record, I told Denise. Of course. Martin looked at me. Pearl, I'm sorry. I closed the pages. I spent years thinking I needed to prove I could lead. My voice stayed steady. Apparently, Dad knew I could. He just preferred me useful instead of visible. Later that afternoon, Dad called me back into his office. The resignation letter was still on his desk. This time, he didn't tell me to sit. Withdraw this. No. Pearl, we can fix this. You had 14 months to do that. He leaned forward. I'll give you the VP position. I almost smiled. That morning, those words would have meant everything to me. Now, they meant almost nothing. Caleb has it. I can change that. No. His expression tightened. What do you want then? Nothing. That answer seemed to confuse him. I can match whatever they're paying you. You don't even know where I'm going. Then tell me. I paused. Meridian Logistics. Dad went still. He knew the company. Everyone in our industry did. What position? Senior Vice President of Operations. He stared at me. The title was above the one he had refused to give me, and the division I would oversee was larger than his entire operations department. What Dad didn't understand was that Meridian hadn't recruited me because I was Richard Bennett's daughter. Industry executives already knew who had led Bennett's turnaround. They had watched our service metrics improve. They had seen accounts recover. They knew my name because my work had traveled farther than Dad's willingness to recognize it. When did this happen, he asked. 3 days ago. You were negotiating with another company behind my back? I was recruited. I hadn't accepted. His eyes narrowed. When did you accept? I looked directly at him. 11 minutes after I walked out of that conference room, his face changed. He finally understood what my 6 words had meant. Then he can learn without me. This company is your family's legacy, Dad said. A legacy that requires me to stay invisible isn't mine to protect. He looked away. For once, there was no order he could give that would change my decision. I completed my 2 weeks, professionally. I organized records, documented open projects, and transferred every responsibility required by my director role. I didn't delete anything, I didn't withhold information, and I didn't sabotage Caleb. I simply stopped doing his job for him. That difference became obvious almost immediately. During his first major client escalation, Caleb called me 3 times. The first time he wanted me to join the meeting. You're the VP, I told him. The client trusts you. Then you should start giving them a reason to trust you. During a forecasting review, one manager asked him to explain a projected capacity shortage. Caleb turned toward me automatically. I didn't answer. The question had been directed to him. Dad began attending Caleb's meetings, then his vendor reviews, then his client calls. The man who had promoted Caleb to strengthen the company's succession plan was spending more and more of his time doing damage control. Martin eventually raised the operational continuity problem with the board. My resignation had forced them to examine something they should have examined earlier. Who was actually running the division? The answer wasn't comfortable. Too much institutional knowledge and responsibility had been concentrated around me, while executive authority had been handed somewhere else. The board reviewed the promotion process. They didn't punish Dad simply for choosing his son. They challenged his judgment in promoting someone inexperienced while deliberately expecting another employee to perform the substance of the role. Dad lost something he valued deeply: control. From then on, executive appointments required additional board and compensation committee review. He could remain CEO, but he could no longer decide major promotions entirely on his own. Caleb kept the VP title temporarily. The board put him on a formal performance plan. For the first time in his career, Dad couldn't quietly move the finish line for him. Caleb missed forecasting targets. Then he mishandled a major client escalation. Without me stepping in before mistakes became visible, his actual level of experience became measurable. At the end of his review period, the board removed him as vice president of operations. They offered him a business development position better suited to his experience. He called me that evening. "You got what you wanted." I was sitting in my apartment reviewing notes for a Meridian meeting. "What exactly do you think I wanted?" "My job." I set my pen down. "Caleb, I already have a job." "You know what I mean?" "No, I don't." He went quiet. Then I said the only thing that needed saying. "I didn't take your job away. I stopped doing it for you." He had no answer. Our relationship became distant after that. So did mine with Dad. During my first month at Meridian, he called several times. I didn't answer immediately. Eventually, I did. His voice sounded different, less like my CEO, more like my father. "I thought you'd stay," he admitted. "I know, you always stayed." "I know that too." There was a long silence. Then he apologized. I didn't pretend one apology could erase 9 years of being valuable enough to carry responsibility, but somehow never valuable enough to receive equal authority. I told him we could try to have a relationship as father and daughter, but he would never control my career again. 3 months after leaving Bennett Industrial Systems, I walked into my first major executive review at Meridian. My nameplate was waiting at the head of the operations table. Pearl Bennett, Senior Vice President. Operations. Halfway through the meeting, a difficult capacity question came up. The CEO looked directly at me. "Pearl, what's your recommendation?" Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked toward my father. Nobody expected me to whisper the answer so someone else could repeat it. I gave my recommendation. The decision carried my name. And when members of my team presented work they had developed, I made sure their names stayed attached to it. 6 months later, Bennett Industrial Systems stabilized under an externally recruited VP. Dad remained CEO, but with stronger board oversight. Caleb stayed in business development, where advancement depended on his own performance, and I stayed at Meridian. I still had the transition folder Dad pushed across that conference table that morning. I didn't keep it because I needed evidence anymore. I kept it because every time I saw it, I remembered the moment I finally understood the difference between being needed and being valued. For years, I thought becoming indispensable would eventually earn my father's respect. Instead, being indispensable convinced him I would tolerate anything. He was wrong. My father gave my promotion to my brother and told me to train him. But the moment I stopped carrying someone else's title, I finally stepped into my own.